Well, folks, we're going to get started. My name's Alex Sabo. I'm the chair of psychiatry here and the program director of the training for psychiatric residents in psychiatry at Berkshire Medical Center. And I'd like to welcome you to a special event today entitled, really the title of Dr. Shea's book, Odysseus in America and the Combat Trauma and the Trials of Homecoming. I'd like to first appreciate that a number of our veterans are here today and their families, and we'd like to express appreciation to all of you for coming today and glad that you're here. And for the rest of us who are here to learn as much as we can on this subject. The event is in part supported by a grant that we have from the Department of Public Health on preventing suicide and on educating the public on various ways to be helpful to people at risk of suicide and developing resilience. So this is in part related to that effort. I would also like to say that I just met in person today Dr. Shea. I've long admired his work. The book that he had written earlier called Achilles in Vietnam, and then his second book, Odysseus in America, talking about the two phases of life of a combat veteran, or two of the phases, one of those in a war zone, and then those trying to make it back home to restore their lives. They're both very beautiful books, and from his work as a psychiatrist at the Veterans Administration in Boston, treating combat veterans largely at the Vietnam War, he learned, very much about them and their situation, and then saw how 2,500, 2,800 years ago, the warrior poets that took on the identity of Homer actually were talking about the very same things that he was learning from the men in the present that he was helping. One of the things I greatly admire about Dr. Shea is that not only did he use many different approaches to helping the combat veterans he worked with, biologic psychiatry, psychologic means, existential means. He also used social psychiatry and understood the power of the group and the culture. And he tried to make a better future for soldiers in our country by figuring out what had gone wrong and were there ways he could help train military leadership to actually be more responsive and helpful. I know that in reading his books, there's a section that he articulates about stressing active leadership, team cohesion, and training people for task. And the residents that we teach in psychiatry, the medical directors of our units, the other leaders in the mental health area, we try to teach those same principles because many of the conditions of secondary trauma that people endure who are trying to help victims of domestic violence, sexual abuse, poverty, untreated mental illness, untreated substance abuse, that can take a toll on the families and caregivers as well. And those same principles that Dr. Shea has articulated apply very much. Active leadership, team cohesion, training for tasks. So I'll tell you just a tiny bit more about Dr. Shea, and then we'll have him speak. That, as I mentioned, he worked at the VA in Boston for 20 years. He retired from his active clinical practice in 2008. And has really been working on what he calls his missionary work, which is preventive psychiatry in military organizations. He's been worked at U.S. military institutions, was a visiting scholar at large at the U.S. Naval War College. He's performed as the Commandant of the Marine Corps Trust Study. He served as the Chair of Ethics, Leadership, and Personnel Policy in the Office of the U.S. Army Deputy Chief of Staff for Personnel. He was the Omar Bradley Chair of Strategic Leadership at the U.S. Army College, jointly with Dickinson College. He's been a MacArthur Fellow since January 2008. As I mentioned, his 2 books, he's the author of those, Achilles in Vietnam, Combat Trauma, and the Undoing of Character, and of Odysseus in America, Combat Trauma, and the Trials of Homecoming. This latter book has a foreword that was authored jointly by U.S. Senators John McCain and Max Cleland. He's currently attempting to wrestle to the ground a multi-volume work titled Trust Within Fighting Forces, Its Significance, Its Creation, Maintenance, and Destruction. He's contributed to understanding the role of theater in the democratic polity of classic Athens, where every citizen was an ipso facto soldier or sailor, and the polity itself constantly at war. He's planning expansion of the theme into a book once his wrestling match with it's over. He's delivered some high-profile lectures as well in the classics. An example would be the Eitner Lecture in Classics at Stanford University. And the title of that was Agamemnon, Achilles, Odysseus, Homer on Military Leadership. Dr. Shea is a class of 1963 graduate of Harvard College. He has an ABD from Columbia and an MD PhD from the University of Pennsylvania. It's our great pleasure to have Dr. Shea with us today. Thank you for coming.
Thank you a second time for such a kind introduction. So, I do want to just mention one thing. It's being a shameless author, it could be heard as a plug for Odysseus in America. But I want to point out that the thing that was important to me about getting McCain and Cleland to jointly author the foreword was not what they said. It's a good enough foreword, not anything anybody's going to want to anthologize because it's great qualities. But as far as I was concerned, they could have copied pages, columns from the Manhattan Telephone book, as long as they both signed their names to it. A conservative Republican and a liberal Democrat. That was my mission, for them to, whatever they said, that they said it together. That the issue of veterans, mental health, and the issue of the occupational health and safety in the mental health area of our service members is not a partisan issue. It isn't a Republican thing or a Democrat thing, a liberal thing or a conservative thing. It's just the right thing to be doing. So with that preface, the title is Odysseus in America of this talk, and I will talk specifically about the way Homer's Odyssey really is about what it says it's about. It's about Nostoi, homecomings. It says that in the opening lines of the poem. But because there's a lot of different things balls that I'm trying to keep in the air. I want to start by giving you a real flyover of the language that I will use and try and explain what it means in a way that you will not find hard to either understand or remember. I, first of all, abominate the term PTSD. I was one of the group that went last year to the American Psychiatric Association. Others in the group were General Pete Corelli, the recently retired Vice Chief of Staff of the Army, and General Romeo Dallaire from the Canadian Forces, who is now a senator in Canada. And it was a plea with the American Psychiatric Association to just change the name from post-traumatic stress disorder to post-traumatic stress injury. So, without going down that rabbit hole, I can report that so far the American Psychiatric Association has been completely boneheaded about it all, and that I don't predict success in that quest. So, PTSD, as it appears, formally defined in the diagnostic manual, is not bad for the description of a certain kind of injury. And I'm going to invite you to try and imagine yourself into the perspective of a trauma surgeon in the emergency department who is dealing with a civilian casualty. It could be a gunshot wound, it could be an auto smash, and so what is the process that surgeon goes through? Well, because I know military examples better, I'll take a military example. A high velocity bullet or a mortar round takes off a soldier's or Marine's arm at the elbow. That is the primary injury. Is that injury going to kill that soldier or Marine? The answer is generally not, but the complications, and that's a term that surgeons use, of bleeding to death through severed arteries, hemorrhage, or a few days or weeks later, infection, if the wound is not properly treated. So you have their primary injury and complications, and then a third dimension, which is wound contamination. That's a less familiar term to people who aren't surgeons. In the surgical situation, it's foreign bodies that have been embedded in the wound, and military wounds are usually contaminated by fragments of soil or rock or wood and fragments of the soldier's own uniform or equipment that have been driven into the wound. So I'm building an analogy here, but I invite you to wrap your mind around it, and then I'll ask you to tell me if it works for you. So the primary injury, what is the primary injury that people get from going to war? Well, it's a kind of change in the brain the mind, the mode of social connection, and often the set of cultural beliefs that a person has that emerge from the real situation. And I emphasize this is the real situation that they have gone into, where other human beings are trying to kill them and doing a damn good job of it. And this soldier or Marine who's now entered this world of war has seen what a good job the enemy is doing. And to just bookmark something without going into the details, the thing that makes the enemy so damn dangerous is that the enemy is human, just like us, and has all of the same virtues that we are so proud of. That's what makes the enemy so dangerous. But the enemy still is the enemy, and you're in the situation where these other human beings are trying to kill you, and you engage in adaptations. Some of these adaptations are profoundly physiological, and some of them undoubtedly could be demonstrated among our related ancestor-like species, some of them down to the level of lizards. So the DSM diagnosis, PTSD, is not a bad summary of what that looks like. It's not perfect, and there are items in the Chinese menu layout that maybe don't fit perfectly into my simplification. But they're in the menu has 3 columns. 2 from column A, 1 from column B, or whatever it is, 3 from column C. And but the columns are not bad as tags for the groupings of these adaptations. And what are they? One group is known as the hyperarousal cluster. And in that you get the jumpiness, the hyperactive startle reaction, on and on. I'm not going to march you through all of the diagnostic criteria, but just sort of toss out some examples as memory triggers. Now, what is this? It is an adaptation. It's a mobilization of the body and the mind to meet mortal danger. I'm certain that this can be demonstrated certainly it can be demonstrated in rats. And it probably can be demonstrated in lizards. It's a basic adaptation in a world that has various kinds of dangers in it. Okay, so the second cluster is a kind of hyper-remembering. Now, that cluster goes under the tag intrusive symptoms. That's the repetitive combat nightmares, the intrusive thoughts, the intrusive memories. Flashbacks, which I personally believe are an artifact of sleep loss. Flashbacks are difficult to research and in some ways are actually a fairly rare phenomenon. But I have the conviction, which is my belief and not a scientific fact, that a veteran who is well rested, who has adequate, good quality sleep, will never have a flashback. because I see it as being an intrusion of REM sleep, rapid eye movement sleep, brain physiology, into waking life due to sleep loss. But that's my private conjecture, and please don't quote that as a fact. So you have the cluster of adaptations that are saying to you, this is what mortal danger looks like, and don't you ever forget it. Don't you, if you're a raccoon that has had a grizzly bear lunge out of a blackberry thicket at it, it's saying to the raccoon, don't go near blackberry thickets. It's that kind of thing. Don't forget what mortal danger looks like. Okay, then the third cluster of adaptations is a kind of resource sparing. This is the numbing and withdrawal cluster, which I believe could be understood as adaptation to mortal danger that is drawing the conclusion, I'm going to shut down every single interest, every relationship, every emotion, every activity that does not directly serve the goal of surviving when other human beings are trying to kill me and doing a damn good job of it. And what numbing and withdrawal would look like in animal research, I don't know. But the other two are pretty easy to, better be careful what I'm filming with. The others are pretty easy to see in other species. It's part of our physical nature to respond to danger in these ways by learning, by generalizing, by adapting. So that's the primary injury. My observation is that the primary injury in the absence of any complications or wound contamination is rarely globally disabling for this veteran to be unable to lead a good human life. This primary injury can certainly impose focal disabilities. Let me give you an example. One of my patients was a Marine infantry vet of Vietnam, and after Vietnam went to work for the gas company in Boston. And the foreman's custom was to hold a muster of the repairmen in the gas company yard early in the morning and pass out the work orders. Well, my patient, being an infantry veteran, found this just unbearable, that he could not do it. It read to him as bunching up, which for an infantryman is a fundamental no-no. You don't bunch up because you become a, quote, lucrative target for a sniper or a mortarman. Now, he could tell you rationally that there were no snipers, there were no mortarmen around the gas company yard, but he just couldn't do it. It was the persistence of this valid adaptation to other people trying to kill you into civilian life. Fortunately for him, his boss was also a combat veteran of a prior conflict and got it immediately as soon as this veteran told him what was going on for him. And he said, "No problem. I'll put your work orders in this tin box under the eaves. You come in early before the muster, pick up your work orders, get in your truck, and do your work, and everything will be fine." Everything was fine, and he eventually had, at the time, he had a medical retirement because of heart disease. He had been working for the gas company for 30 years, roughly. He hadn't advanced because he still had other problems that stood in the way of advancement, but he had managed to keep the job, and I have no reason to think it wasn't a basically good employment adaptation. So, and just as an aside, this example that I gave of this foreman and this veteran is an example of something called a workplace accommodation. This phrase is a term of art in the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it scares the shit out of employers. The moment they hear workplace accommodations, they're thinking architect's fees, putting in wheelchair accessible ramps to the 3rd floor at enormous expense, and they run the other way. But the typical workplace accommodation for a combat veteran with psychological injuries is as simple and costless and not requiring paperwork or governmental involvement as this foreman and this Marine veteran. So that's sort of a digression, but one that I want you to hear, and all the people that you know in the community who are talking about employing veterans and so forth. There's enormous scope for simple and costless workplace accommodation. Okay, so those are the 3 big categories of the primary injury, summarized as an persisting adaptation to the real situation of other human beings trying to kill you. Now, what are the complications? Well, you all know what some of the complications are. Substance use disorders, substance use, alcohol being the leading one, and street drugs and prescription drugs being way, way down in the league table as far as substances of abuse and dependency by veterans, psychologically injured veterans. I want to linger a little bit on alcohol. I personally have no religious scruples against alcohol. I trust, enjoy a glass of wine or a glass of beer this evening after this without any uneasiness at all. But I can tell you, as a person who has looked at the pharmacology of alcohol as a medicine for sleep, that it was designed by Satan himself. There are 2 features of the pharmacology of alcohol that make it catastrophic. One is that it's metabolized way too quickly, or burned off in layman's terms. So a veteran with simple psychological injury. At this moment, it's uncomplicated. He's jacked up. He's hyper aroused and can't sleep. Maybe has some intrusive memories and decides he's going to help himself get to sleep, and he knocks back a couple stiff ones. Well, it's metabolized so fast that if he does that at 10 o'clock, the pharmacological sedative effect, hypnotic effect, is likely to be gone by midnight. But there's a second feature of alcohol that is as bad or worse, and that is the tolerance, which is the jargon for getting a smaller and smaller dose, smaller and smaller effect with repeating doses. People are aware of people developing a chronic tolerance to alcohol, in that some people who are now a quart a day of whiskey alcoholics didn't start that way. And they'll tell you that I need to put away a quart of whiskey a day just to be normal. And that's not completely bogus, because what they're doing is exhibiting the phenomenon of tolerance, and the opposite, the flip side of tolerance, is always a withdrawal syndrome. So if that quart a day guy goes cold turkey, he is likely to have severe and even potentially fatal withdrawal symptoms from alcohol, known as delirium tremens. But the way veterans frequently get there is, so remember I said that tolerance develops so fast. What that means is that when the dose is metabolized and gone, that the person is into a mini withdrawal. So actually, somebody who knocked back 2 stiff ones to get to sleep wakes up way too few hours later, but even more wired. And this veteran makes a not irrational. I mean, you can see that he can innocently think this, that if 2 stiff ones got me to sleep at 10 o'clock, then 3 stiff ones at 2 o'clock or 12 o'clock will get me back to sleep. And he's not wrong in that. It will if he ups the dose. But you can see how this man is now on the icy stairway to alcohol dependency and abuse. That he is developing a progressive and eventually chronic tolerance. And this is a catastrophe. It is, and I will spare you a rant. You see, I'm bald, I tear my hair when I rant. I'll spare you the rant on how irrational it is that the most readily available and in many ways least expensive sedative hypnotic medicine that requires the fewest hoops to jump through to get is alcohol. And this is a drug that is very badly suited to helping people sleep, disastrously bad. And it's furthermore toxic to just about every organ system in the body that you can name when taken in large doses chronically. And yet we have a set of laws that says that if one veteran gives another a Valium, say, from his prescription, he's breaking the law and in theory could go to prison for it. And there is no other, unless you are defining any withdrawal syndrome as a toxicity, which is a very weird thing to do. Apart from a withdrawal syndrome that is quite effectively treated and safely treated, especially compared to delirium tremens, that there are no known long-term toxicities to any of the benzodiazepines, of which Valium is the best known. That's not to say that they're harmless and that people can't get into trouble with them, but it's just insanity the way our drug laws work. Absolute insanity. So I will not rant further on that. So I talked about, and I think I'll just stop with alcohol dependence and abuse as a complication. You get there are other complications. The complications certainly can be fatal and disastrous. Alcohol abuse being an obvious example. But another complication of the simple adaptation is danger seeking. After all, Vietnam veterans did not invent fast motorcycle riding. There's a famous quote from T.E. Lawrence of Arabia, on his own motorcycle riding, where he says, this is almost an exact quote from memory, Buenerges, the name he gave to his motorcycle. And I set a new era in Oxfordshire, doing 95 miles an hour when the rest of the traffic was moving at 25 miles an hour. And just about everybody, at least everybody who saw the great film Lawrence of Arabia knows that he killed himself on his motorcycle. Apparently as an accident, but a sort of a predictable accident waiting to happen when you roar around narrow lanes at 95 miles an hour. So I'm going to stop there with the complications and move on to wound contamination, because this is in a certain sense, the new kid on the block in the discussion of combat trauma. And the main form of wound contamination that I have observed, and if anybody can think of others that fits this general conceptual scheme, I'd be happy to hear it. But I've used the phrase moral injury. It's a resonant phrase, a memorable phrase, and I'm not the first person to bring these two words into collision in the English language. But I appear to have been the person that coined this as a term of art in mental health. And I want to talk to you about what moral injury is, because it really does function like wound contamination in that traumatic amputation of the forearm in a soldier or Marine. If there is dead tissue or foreign bodies, dead tissue functions as a foreign body, or basically you can stop there, dead tissue or foreign bodies in a wound after it's closed, that wound is never going to heal. It will always be infected. It will be chronically draining, chronically infected, and very often will kill the person who carries that contaminated wound. So trauma surgeons are very careful about what they call debridement and finding foreign matter in any wound and washing the hell out of the wound and getting foreign bodies out because they know they're set up for failure. Now, people hear all the times about so-and-so who died at the age of 95, carrying a bullet in his spine since World War II. Well, such things do happen, but nobody plans on that, and nobody actually knows the percentage of people who fit the description of having a bullet lodged in their spine who died as a result of the wound contamination versus those whose bodies managed to seal off this foreign body and just keep it quiescent. That's a digression. I mean, we don't need to go down into those surgical weeds. Now, moral injury functions like wound contamination in that it appears to me that if it's not addressed, that it prevents the primary injury and its complications from ever really being resolved. Now, let me put some meat on the bones for this resonant phrase. First of all, I need to acknowledge that there is a second use. I'll tell you both uses of this phrase, moral injury, and they differ only slightly from each other, but it's a difference that matters and that you should know about. The first definition of moral injury was the one that I apparently developed. Three things, when all three are present, moral injury is present. Number one, a betrayal of what's right. I put that in common language terms. It's something that's within the culture. It's the code that every culture has of what's praiseworthy and blameworthy. The codes may vary all over the lot, but it's like a backside. Everybody has one. That every culture has a code of what's right. So betrayal of what's right, number one. Number two, by someone who holds legitimate authority. Now, here you see the effect of my commitment to preventive psychiatry, because this is something actually that we can do something about. That the average ethical performance of leaders in military institutions is extremely sensitive to the environment of policy, practice, and culture in that military organization. And there are visible things that we could do that would lift the average level of ethical performance in our forces, but they're a monster to bring about because of the institutional and cultural resistance. But that's a whole vast other subject. Anybody that's interested in some of what that looks like, part 3 of Odysseus, this is a shameless plug, folks. Part 3 of Odysseus in America is titled Preventing Psychological and Moral Injury in Military Service, and explains the why and the what of the changes that are needed. And then Appendix 3 explained that as of 2002 what the policy weeds needed to be dug out or cut down in order to get it done. And that's somewhat a moving target, more of a moving target than the what and why. So number one, betrayal of what's right. Number two, by someone who holds legitimate authority. Number three, in a high-stakes situation. Now, this is just me being sort of empirically or logically complete, because it's a legitimate and commonplace observation that nobody has ever suffered moral injury from discovering that somebody is cheating on penny ante poker. Usually it's an occasion for hilarity in a family or among friends when you're playing penny ante poker and somebody is discovered to have aces up his sleeve. And it's just that the stakes aren't high enough. So in war, of course, the stakes are never higher. So betrayal of what's right by someone in legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. Legitimacy and authority are squarely in the social system. Remember, the code of what's right is in the culture. And the stakes are necessarily and inevitably in part in the mind of the person who is injured. Most poignantly, the characteristic awfulness in war when my beloved comrade, who's been my battle buddy, is killed or maimed. And my love for my comrade, and love is the right word for this, my love for my comrade is the stakes, and it's in my heart, in my mind. It's not out there somewhere, it's inside. And so those three elements. Now, I want to alert you to a second usage of the phrase moral injury. I know pretty much all of the people who have created this second use. One of them was even an intern in our program for a year as a psych intern. Maybe it wasn't a whole year, maybe it was 9 months. Anyway, so the relevant names here are Brett Litz, L-I-T-Z, Sharon Ewan, M-A-G-U-E-N, and Bill Nash, spelled the way. Bill is a retired Army, Navy captain, psychiatrist, who in his last assignment was responsible for combat and operational stress control in the Marine Corps. So these are all good people. They are prominent in their own ways, and they putting what they say in the same 1, 2, 3 format, you'll see how it's different. Betrayal of what's right, same thing. Number 2, I did it. It's not by someone in legitimate authority, I did it. Number 3, in a high-stakes situation, usually somebody dies or is maimed. But you see that these are related, but they are not exactly the same. And I believe that what they call moral injury can never entirely be eliminated from war unless we simply end the human practice of war, which I heartily endorse. actually many of the military people I've worked with heartily endorse. So they differ only in tiny details in terms of clinical presentation, but I want to say for sure that it's really early days in the development of these concepts and their use in actual on-the-ground mental health. And so I couldn't predict what coming years will show. But coming back to the two basic flavors, it should be obvious to you that they can happen in sequence in either order: flavor A, flavor B, flavor B, flavor A, in any order, and can even happen simultaneously. Let me give you an example, a concrete example, and I won't multiply the examples because these are horrendous stories to hear. This was told to me at the Combat and Operational Stress Control Conference in San Diego a few years ago. The Marine Corps puts on every year. And the incident happened at one of the fights in Fallujah, and there was a Marine Scout sniper team supporting an engaged Marine infantry which had taken several casualties from a very skilled and well-concealed enemy sniper. And eventually, the team located this sniper, and both of the two members of the Scout sniper team have scopes, and they could both see that the enemy sniper had a baby strapped to his front in what we would call a snuggly baby carrier. Now, the Marine sniper thought he was doing this as a human shield, which of course made him even more fired up with rage. But I just want to point out that if this enemy sniper was into martyr ideology in Islam, he might have been saying to himself, I want my son to join me in paradise when we are both martyred. Or he could have just been reasoning practically, distorted. You and I would agree, with not the kind of decision we would ever wish to even imagine making, where he says to himself, if I'm dead, he might as well be dead, because his life will become so brutal and ugly as an orphan that it'll be better for him if I take him with me. So he didn't necessarily have to be using this baby as a human shield without having some kind of reasoning as to why it was a good thing to do. We don't have to subscribe to either piece of reasoning, but just to realize that the enemy is lamentably human, like us. That the thing that makes the enemy so damn dangerous is that the enemy has every single one of the same virtues that we have. They're self-sacrificing, they're enduring, they're observant, they're innovative. You can just run on and on and on. Everything that we praise ourselves for is something that the enemy also possesses. That's what makes him so damn dangerous. The most formidable thing on the battlefield is the human being. Forget the weapons. I mean, the weapons count, but it's the human being that's the real danger on the battlefield. Anyway, so what happens when somebody is morally injured? And I'm just going to dispose of immediately the one currently observed difference in the symptom picture of the two forms of moral injury and go to what they have in common, which is much larger than what's different. What's different is that Liz, McEwen, and Nash say that the body does not get jacked up in moral injury in the same way the body gets jacked up by the hyperarousal in the pure original PTSD. In the form of moral injury that I have observed, the body gets every bit as much jacked up, that the body codes moral injury when it originates from leadership malpractice. And that the body codes it as physical attack, that you can even have a full, and I often pose to audiences one of the nastiest and ugliest thought experiments that you can imagine. And that is to imagine as vividly as yourself you can for your life situation, whatever that life situation is, something that fits the description, betrayal of what's right by someone in legitimate authority in a high-stakes situation. And if you imagine it in detail and with vividness, you'll find your body is beginning to react. Your guts will churn, your heart rate will increase. The body codes it as physical attack and physical danger. But in the other, according to these very well-established researchers, the body does not react. I'm sort of amazed, but that's what they say, and I'm not second guessing. So you can see that they're related, and one can lead to the other. That in any order, and they can happen in the same instant, where it's both a leadership malpractice, and while it becomes sort of a philosophic issue, if, especially in a combat zone, if people are there for any length of time, they do figure out that refusal of an order is, in fact, an option. They may, most of the time, forego the option, but it is not quite so absolute that an order is an order and I must do it, especially after a long fight. And so a leader gives a grossly unethical and probably illegal order, and the soldier or Marine obeys it, and may in one and the same moment experience leadership malpractice and I did it when they do this heinous thing. Or it may not be heinous, it may be a violation of the culture. Imagine a situation of a Marine infantry platoon that gets into a really bad scrape and they've taken several casualties, and the platoon commander makes the judgment call. This position we're in is totally untenable. If we stay here, we're all going to die, but we have a little window of opportunity to get the hell out, and gives the order, we're gone, we're out of here. And one of the infantrymen says, but Joe is wounded and he's out there, we can hear him screaming and asking for help. And the lieutenant says, out. Now, at that moment, the person who said Joe was out there has the choice of saying, fuck you, I'm going after him, or obeying the order. And if he obeys the order, he is very liable to carry with him the second flavor of moral injury, I did it, but will also feel tremendous moral injury because that lieutenant has violated the clear culture of the Marine Corps. We don't leave nobody behind, not even our dead. We don't leave them behind. And so they can happen simultaneously or one after another in any order. Okay, so having talked about two flavors of moral injury, they have a lot in common in how they wreck people. First of all, the capacity for trust is devastating. Now, when you talk about trust, people tend to sort of make it very global and fuzzy. But if you really have no capacity for trust, it doesn't leave just a vacuum. Nothing's there. It is always replaced by an active expectancy of harm, exploitation, and humiliation. So that every human encounter is construed in the sense of how is this person going to harm, exploit, or humiliate. Now, that is a state of pain, first of all. And I want to point out to you that we don't learn one little tiny bit more about this human being whose capacity for trust has been devastated by calling it paranoia. That's psychobabble. We don't learn anything more by using the psychobabble. I strongly recommend to anybody to stick close to the phenomenon, which is the expectancy of harm, exploitation, humiliation. So, if that is your settled expectation, what are your options? You have a really shrunk set of options. You can strike first, and the clinicians in this audience will pretty much all have personally encountered somebody, not necessarily from military service, but from either incarceration, trauma, or any condition of coercive control, like an incest family is a mini concentration camp, or someone who's survived a political torture regime, that you will have encountered the strike first strategy where the first time you're meeting this patient and introducing yourself, he's already going after you for something that supposedly you did or failed to do. That if you did it or didn't do it, it happened in an eye blink and you didn't know what was happening. But strike first. The second option is to withdraw, to run and hide, and people who've worked with psychologically and morally injured combat veterans become aware of those who live out in the boonies, in the woods, minimizing their contact with other people to the maximum degree possible. living in attics and basements, only coming out at night when they think they will not encounter another soul. So, withdrawal. And you see Achilles withdraw when Agamemnon, his boss, betrays what's right in a totally illegitimate way. I just say as an aside that the evidence of the text of the Iliad is that Agamemnon had no more right to seize Achilles' Geras, his prize of honor, who happened to be a captive woman, than a modern infantry colonel who has in his battalion a sergeant who has received the Medal of Honor, and no more right to take Achilles' Geras than this colonel on parade sees the Medal of Honor ribbon on the sergeant's tunic and says, "Oh, you have that and I don't," and pull it off his tunic and put it on his own. What would he say? What's wrong with that guy? I mean, this is a total violation of the local code of what's right for Agamemnon to do it. And in the course of the Iliad, the other Greek officers say to Agamemnon, "You shouldn't have done that." And the gods on Mount Olympus looking down saying, "He shouldn't have done that." And eventually in the Iliad, Agamemnon says, "I shouldn't have done that." So it's not something that Shea is putting into, from the 21st century, putting into the 9th century BCE. It's there in the text. So, I've lost my thread here. So, the consequences of destruction of trust. So, 3 alternatives: strike first, hide, and then the third we see brilliantly with Odysseus, which is create false identities. Odysseus creates maybe 2 or 3 in the course of 4, I don't know the count, in the course of the Odyssey, and is a master of deception. And that's in fact what we learn about Odysseus, is that he's a brilliant deception planner and deception leader. And so that's the third option. And that appears to exhaust the personae that are sent from central casting into the imagination of somebody with moral injury. There is a fourth that we can think of, but if the morally injured veteran can even imagine this, their recovery is well advanced. And that is a freely cooperating partner, where neither is dominating or intimidating the other, where a partnership of mutual respect and inevitably partial contribution to the whole of the quest of the veteran's recovery. And so those are the if your capacity for trust is devastated, you are very much more likely to be recruited into criminal enterprises. Not that morally injured combat veterans immediately trust criminals, but they know about tight partnerships where each is both looking after and watching the other very closely, the way battle buddies do. And actually, two of my patients in Boston, you can't make this stuff up, were in their prior criminal careers a safe-cracking gang that a third member of the program had been on the Boston, a detective on the Boston police force, whose assignment at one point was to get indictable evidence against these two. He claimed that he knew who they were, but they could never get the evidence. They had this truly imaginative method of operation. They would identify a safe they wanted in one of the old buildings in Boston and would steal a tow truck, back it up to where the safe was in relation to the outside of the building, run the tow cable through a window, wrap it around the safe, and then just pull the safe through the wall, bricks and all, and drive away with it, crank it up, drive with the safe to one of the quarries in Quincy where they would blow it in privacy in the night. One of them had extensive explosives training in Vietnam. And so he put his military skills to civilian use. It is a painful fact that when you ask, some of you, many of you in this audience will know what the DD-214 is. It's what people refer to as their discharge papers. And I haven't examined the current equivalent form closely enough to see if it's still there, but there used to be a block that said civilian equivalent occupation, and there'd be a code number in there. And the code book would have been something provided by the Department of Labor. And the code, civilian equivalent occupation for Army and Marine infantry was, anybody happen to know this offhand? It's so bizarre. What is the civilian equivalent occupation of a combat infantry? According to the Department of Labor, it is a firearms-proof technician. And what does a firearms-proof technician do? He test fires firearms for the manufacturers on a range. This is such a bizarrely truncated version of the skills of an infantryman, which are incredibly complex, and are not exhausted by firing a gun at a fixed target on a range. It is so bizarre as to be the subject for a joke. And so what are the actual civilian occupations that being a combat infantryman suits one brilliantly for? Number one, you've already guessed, criminal, which is heartbreaking. You don't want to go that way in your imagination, but it is a fact that the concrete skills that are required through training and then being in a long, close infantry fight are brilliantly usable in a criminal career. That's number one. And the second occupation is prisoner, because unfortunately most of our prison tiers are war zones where you must, if you want to survive, you must be ready to kill instantly and skillfully. And this is an indictment of our prison system, but it is a fact on the ground. And one of the two members of this safe-cracking gang had done time and has had a number of others. And it was so clear that his combat skills enabled him to survive and even prosper in prison. Going to apply the word prosper to that hideous environment. Anyway, so to pick up the overall narrative thread. So I want to talk about one other aspect of moral injury. Both forms are identical in this, and that is that it promotes despair. Now, despair and depression aren't quite the same thing, people. I'm not going to get into definitional slog, but my understanding of despair is where one has given up all hope of ever being capable of virtue. I can never, ever, no matter what I do, be a good human being. It's about who I am, not what I did. If you wish to call it shame, okay, but that peculiar quality of despair that people with moral injury get. And I don't pretend to have the whole truth of this in my back pocket, but I'm quite certain that despair is fertile soil for suicide. Very fertile soil for suicide. So on that downer, I think I'm going to ask for and you're my timekeeper, so I don't know how much time is left.
35 minutes.
35 minutes, great. I'd like to hear your ideas, comments, questions, arguments. Tell me where I'm full of shit. Tell me what you want to say or ask. So I'm told that this flying saucer here will pick up questions for the recording, so we don't have to pass a microphone around.
If you could repeat them, that would double check it. If you repeat the question, that'd be good.
Okay, I will do. Remind me if I forget, because I'm already thinking about what I'm going to say when I'm hearing the question. So, please, yes.
Are there any differences between PTSD or Vietnam veterans and Afghanistan multiple deployment combat?
So repeat.
Yeah, the question is, I'm going to paraphrase it, what's different in these recent wars from the Vietnam War or from other wars? I get this question a lot, especially from Daily Deadline journalists, and I say, boy, have you got the wrong guy. I wrote the book that said that war is war is war is war and hasn't changed in 3,000 years. And then I sort of give them an inch and say, well, I don't know that we know what the effect of, for instance, having frequent, even daily contact with people back home via things like Skype and cell phones and so forth. That's, of course, huge. Anybody who was in Vietnam as an enlisted man knew that it sort of took an act of Congress involving the Red Cross and so forth to have a phone call home, and it was always in the most extreme emergency. And now there are many people who are talking daily, sometimes more than once a day to family. It's amazing. I presume that's going to have some impact. Another is the presence of women in units, which is an order of magnitude both in quantity and in the scope of the roles that women play. It's fascinating to me that people still occasionally will ask, why would women demand to have the right to serve in combat arms if they are physically qualified as objectively determined by physical tests, which are done all the time? And obviously the average of men is stronger than the average of women, but they're very broad distributions, and there are some women who are stronger than a good percentage of men, et cetera, you know, the whole thing. But I think I lost my train.
I'm not a journalist, so I don't have a deadline. The reason I asked that, because of my limited experience, I found that the Vietnam veterans had kind of a strange pride that their war was bloodier, more intense, more dangerous than what's happening in Afghanistan.
If it's your war, and that's not directed at you personally, but the war that one has experienced always carries an electric charge to it that seems to go begging for evidence to justify its specialness. War is my belief that it has always and will always injure people in similar ways. And the comparisons in the clinic, we used to call this pissing contest between, and we discouraged it totally, where one person would be saying, well, my combat was more horrible than yours. And each person's experience is their own, and often you discover that veterans will disparage their own service and minimize what they've been through and say, well, you know, I really had it easy. I just did X, Y, and Z. And you probe a bit further and you discover that only X, Y, and Z included some pretty awful stuff. And as a clinician, for sure, you don't place people on an order of merit. And I think it's a mistake for veterans to place themselves in orders of merit, because very often they do it to their own disadvantage. This was observed by some Holocaust survivors. Among Holocaust survivors, the two psychiatric social workers who called it hierarchies of suffering. So with the Holocaust survivors, you hear a person say, well, you know, I really had it easy. I was hiding in an attic for the whole time, and the family whose house it was were really great. And the people who really had it hard were the people who were hiding in the forest. And then you talk to somebody who was hiding in the forest and say, well, you know, we really had it easy. The people who had a hard time were the people that were caught by the Germans. And you know what happened to them. And then you talk to somebody who was caught by the Germans, and they'd say, you know, at this point you're down the chain all the way to somebody who was sent to Dachau or Auschwitz, and they'll say, well, you know, I really had it easy. It was those people in the next compound where they were doing experimenting on them. They really had it hard. And you discover that the only people in this hierarchy were the people that are dead. That they sort of trump everybody else. And that, and so that's a frequent pattern among trauma survivors, to minimize or place them lower in a hierarchy of suffering. Yes?
So do you have any indication that the high authority making a judgment to go to an unnecessary war in Iraq caused a moral injury? That is, do you have any indication that the nature of that war may have had something to do with an increase in PTSD?
I will repeat the question. Did the, I'm going to editorialize here, screwed up decision to go to war in Iraq lead to the apparently higher rate of PTSD? Take that as an umbrella term.
By betrayal.
Oh, well, or you're addressing specifically the decisions and decision-making processes of the senior civilian leadership that sent these soldiers to war.
Right. The awareness that it was likely an unnecessary war, was that a betrayal experienced by the soldier who was going into it, who then is more prone to developing PTSD?
Was the apparent lack of necessity a war of choice, to take some people's description, rather than a war of necessity? Does that cause or add to the moral injury for people who were there? I have to say that my overwhelming impression is that once somebody is inducted into a modern military organization and trained and indoctrinated, acculturated, and forms the bonds that good military training creates, that the perspective gets very narrow, and that it's what happened within my line of sight, how my leaders were. There are some veterans, for sure, who are very sensitive to these big picture things, but the overwhelming mass of my experience has been with men who were particularly injured by something that happened in that context. And so I don't want to make any sweeping thing. I know I feel tainted by what's been done in our name, and continue to feel tainted by what's being done in our name, especially with the drone attacks, which are largely totally unconscionable, often based on signal intelligence saying that so-and-so, a bad guy, has this cell phone and this is his SIM chip, and they have the means of tracking the SIM chip, and then launching a strike without any corroborating evidence that the person in physical possession of the phone is a quote-unquote bad guy, and will quote-unquote whack him. I hate these slang euphemisms for kill. Will kill him in a surprise strike simply because he's holding this cell phone, or next to the guy holding the cell phone. Either way. Yes.
One of the controversies that I've been hearing something about and encountered personally with one of our patients is individuals who have been discharged dishonorably and begin to experience PTSD and other, and cannot get.
Do you
have any?
I have long thought about and done some writing about so-called bed paper discharges. this is slang for a discharge either characterized as dishonorable, which requires a general court-martial, or undesirable, or a general discharge under less than honorable conditions. And that those three discharge categories render a veteran ineligible for VA benefits. And I have railed against it. I had an op-ed piece in the New York Times in 1998 or something, 99, I don't remember the date. That, first of all, it's so frequent, it's so easy for somebody to get a bad paper discharge as a result of lack of ethical and emotional self-restraint that comes directly from the sleep deprivation, the sleep loss that comes directly from their psychological and moral injury. And so it's like, to me, it's ethically equivalent to taking a wounded soldier who has lost a lot of blood and punishing him for failing to stand at attention for the necessary period of time. And I mean, it's as cruel and stupid and self-defeating as that. And this whole business of bad paper discharges needs a total rework. And that's a huge subject. Other
Yes, in comparison to, you're looking at veterans from different services, different wars, World War II, Vietnam, Korea, Iraq, and Afghanistan. In World War II, you're looking at people coming back with acceptance of what they did. They were not judgmental, not critical, it was a positive. The same thing you see with your Iraq veterans and your Afghanistan veterans, is that this acceptance, there's not a denial that they did wrong, they're doing the duty, support the troops, who care for you, who love you. Korean and Vietnam vets didn't get that. You're lacking them. We came back on that. We didn't have any of this. We're still fighting for that. And fortunate that the Iraq and Afghanistan vets are getting that now. My son-in-law is an Iraq vet, 6 children in Iraq. There's a great support network there. My daughter is put together. When I came from back from Vietnam, there wasn't a support network except for those who was pulled together. And I think that may impact the level of issues related to PTSD and the moral injury issues because there wasn't a lack of support. There was a lack of support for those guys compared to
a couple things. One is that I totally agree that, I mean, the slogan of our program was, recovery happens only in community. That element of support, not necessarily from community with a great big capital C, but a concrete connections between people and support that way. And I have to tell you an amazing thing that happened. I think it was maybe in 2004. I get an email, a UFO just coming through from somebody that I didn't know. My email address is very widely known. And he said, with this painful humility, Dr. Shea, if it isn't too much trouble, I am currently deployed in Iraq, and would you please convey to the Vietnam veterans in your program how grateful those of us in the current theaters are to the Vietnam generation, because they did a lot of the heavy lifting that we don't have to do. They change things for the better, and we appreciate it. What did I have the time? Of course, I printed it immediately and went, put it up on the wall in the group room so that everybody could see this. And it's a fact. There's still a long way to go. And now, in terms of the public, there are known some truly wacko and marginal groups who are doing things like protesting and disrupting at military funerals. But the overwhelming lesson of Vietnam for the American public who have not served, who are not serving, who have no immediate family member who is serving, is that whatever my opinion of the wisdom or justice of this war and why it was initiated, or the wisdom or justice of the operational practices and doctrines that the service members are carrying out in theater, whatever your opinion of their wisdom or justice, you don't take it out on that junior enlisted man coming back through BWI or LAX. They didn't get a vote. It's totally unjust and cruel. Now, something that certainly hasn't helped, I don't think, is things like you should go shopping, which George W. Bush was quoted as saying a year or so after 9/11, perhaps in some misguided effort to get the economy stimulated. But I can tell you that my skin crawls when I'm in a place like BWI or LAX, and there are a lot of servicemen around, and I see somebody merrily walking through the terminal, towing their designer luggage, and in passing without breaking his or her stride. Thank you for your service to a service member there in uniform. And my skin crawls because
It's a feel-good moment.
sorry?
It's a feel-good moment for them.
Yeah, it's a self-indulgent, aren't I a wonderful person? A moment for me to feel virtuous. Oh. What I think counts is for people to do their best to figure out how to help service members coming back from war to make a successful adaptation in the workplace, make a successful adaptation in further education, which many of them are availing themselves of under the GI Bill, to pay attention to things like incarceration rates among veterans and to support the development of so-called veterans courts, which is a prison diversion process that looks different in different parts of the country and is barely a glimmer in anybody's eye in Massachusetts. There's talk, but I don't think any veteran courts exist on the ground at this point. So these are really the way we should be showing our support. I have to say that I don't think honestly, the VA is under-resourced. It's overmanaged, and there would be one hell of a lot more effectiveness if 16 and a half layers of bureaucracy were pruned out of it into a much simpler structure. The people at the pointy end of the spear in the VA often know exactly what they need to be doing. But there's, don't get me started. Anyway, thank you for the question. Yes.
After the Vietnam War, there was a lot of probably trial and error in psychiatry, trying to determine how to treat the returned veterans. Yes, they didn't have as much support as today, but within psychiatry, what would you say are the major improvements in treatment of post-traumatic stress injury?
Well, there are improvements. For one thing, you are now witnessing efforts to treat the injury rather than an utterly mistaken diagnosis. The veterans whose records were sometimes this high stacked on the floor, you could track through the years the successive diagnoses of the same person that was given. Rarely in 1969 would they be given the diagnosis combat neurosis, which would have been the diagnosis that they had inherited from World War II. Much more likely they would be called paranoid schizophrenic because of their mistrust and hostility. You can see how the actual presentation could be spun that way, but it meant that nobody made the effort or took the time to get to know this human being. And so then the next fad was calling them all bipolar affective disorder, or schizoaffective came afterwards. The first
Manic
was
depressive.
Manic depressive, as that's the terminology at the time. And you can see how the phenomenology of somebody swinging between states of just incredible excitation when they're flooded with intrusive symptoms. They're not sleeping. One of my patients at one point roared around Boston with a shotgun on the seat next to him, and he'd blow through toll booths on the turnpike. And it would be easy to diagnose him as manic, and descriptively he was manic, but it was all on the basis of trauma. And honestly, my humble proposal for utterly blowing up the DSM is a very simple expedient for every diagnosis in the DSM to have a checkbox. It might technically be a separate dimension. A checkbox where you check off that this social phobia, or this depression, or this manic state is a post-traumatic syndrome. This has a traumatic origin, where the clinical presentation and the historical data reflect. It is utterly grotesque to think that the DSM PTSD exhausts the phenomenology of severe trauma. It doesn't. This is not in any way disparaging. It is a biological analogy that syphilis used to be called the great imitator because it could produce such a vast array of symptoms affecting the heart, the bones, the brain, on and on. And so in a certain sense, PTSD is protean in that way, that just about every syndrome described in the DSM can be of traumatic origin. I'm not denying for a moment that there are disorders of brain chemistry or brain anatomy that can produce psychiatric symptomatology and disorders. I wouldn't deny that for a moment. But, okay, so that doesn't prove that every disorder that you can describe with some precision is reducible to an inborn error of metabolism, that it cannot be caused by experience. And this is one area that I've been very interested in. I didn't mention that moral injury, both flavors, deteriorates good character. Now, the American Psychiatric Association absolutely breaks out in hives when you propose any diagnostic construct that even remotely sounds like bad experience in adulthood can turn a good person bad. They absolutely won't go there. It violates the philosophic tradition that you can identify with Plato, trace it through the Stoics, you can see it in Immanuel Kant, and it shows up in Freud, who was both an admirer of Kant and the Stoics. And this tradition is that if you make it out of childhood with two good resources, number one, good breeding, that's Plato's term, we would say with good genes, and Plato said that both were necessary, and good upbringing. If you made it out of childhood with those two good resources, no bad experience would budge you off of virtue, off of good character. The good character would form as hard, as rock, as unmovable. This is a beautiful idea, but it's fact. And the problem is that there is great loyalty to this idea within psychiatry, American psychiatry, which has, that the APA has rejected every diagnosis that smells that way. So it has rejected the diagnosis that's in the ICD 9, 10, and 11 called, and the current one, whichever number that one is, called enduring personality change after catastrophic experience. And there's abundant empirical evidence for this, but the APA isn't buying. And then Judith Herman and the Boston Cabal, being the main movers of it, proposed what Judith Herman calls complex PTSD, which I would say in terms of the terminology that I'm talking about here, would be PTSD plus complications plus moral injury. All of those are in Judith Herman's complex PTSD. And that was field trials by the APA under the atrocious acronym DESNOS, disorders of extreme stress not otherwise specified. And it was rejected despite an abundance of evidence because supposedly of Occam's razor, that it was in the view of the leadership unnecessarily proliferating diagnoses, despite the fact that the treatment for simple and uncomplicated PTSD and for Desnos are very, very different. And then there's another entity which was just recently given the cold shoulder. This is a diagnostic construct called post-traumatic embitterment disorder, developed by Michael Linden and his colleagues at the Charité and the Freie Universität of Berlin. And this is based on a kind of moral injury, sort of a different flavor, that they have vast experience of in Berlin and the surrounding areas, where they have these tens of thousands of embittered people who were pursuing what they thought were useful and honorable and praiseworthy occupations in the old East Germany, and whose trajectories in life were just shot out of the air by reunification. And we're not talking about Stasi here, we're talking about fine optics technicians, teachers of chemistry and Latin in the high school, who just were, as I say, their life trajectories were shot out of the sky by reunification and are dealing with it. Anyway, the APA recently gave a cold shoulder to that. They have huge data on it. Okay, I'm ranting now. I better pull down. Yes, you've been trying unsuccessfully to ask your question, and I promised myself that I would not let that happen again.
You mentioned about the recovery and the freely cooperating partner of respect. And I just wondered, just a lot of combat veterans, or many that I know, go into military or criminal work as police officers, and so they're carrying, the weapon every day. And I'm just curious to know your opinion on that. Obviously, for obvious reasons, are they able to achieve recovery if they go into a line of work like that?
That is truly a complex question, which probably leads to all kinds of unresolved philosophical issues about what is a flourishing life for a human being. I had one patient who was a detective in the Boston Police Department. He came to a bad end, but that's another story. And another who was an officer of Walpole State Prison. And I don't really know the answer. It may be a way of staying in combat mode, and in that sense, it's probably not great, but I wouldn't want to legislate it in the sense of saying that nobody who carries that diagnosis from their military service should ever be considered the police or the fire department or the state troopers or any such uniforms. But it's a conundrum. When you see the attraction to the risk, just about every separated combat infantryman feels an enormous sense of vulnerability when they're without a weapon. Enormous sense of vulnerability. It's been so ingrained into them, you are never separated from your weapon. If you're going to the latrine, you take your weapon with you. You don't, inseparable. And there's an interesting title, I haven't read the book, but by a woman veteran called Love My Rifle More Than You, which contains within this pithy statement something that's true in the notions of a recently mobilized combat person. And many women are, let's face it, they are in combat. They may not be in all combat MOSs, but they're, I mean, somebody manning a 50 caliber machine gun on the, the light machine gun on the roof of a Humvee
50
is,
cal gunner on top of a
has,
Humvee, yeah.
sorry?
It's a 50 cal gunner on top of a Humvee.
Right, I mean, they are in combat as surely as somebody who is assaulting a building. Different skill set, but it's still here for. Thank you all. It's been wonderful.
I don't think that is there a plan for the driver to pick me up here and take me to your house? Okay, let me see if I, no, this is my pickup this morning.
10:15.
Yeah,
So
it doesn't, that's when I was picked up in Shelburne, and so I don't see anything
So you can
subsequent to this.
drive, you can ride 10 times. Okay. Are you gonna come with me? Are you
Well,
gonna come with me? Yeah.
actually, I was assuming that.
Okay, beautiful.
Practical
Okay, and then the
logistics.
driver's gonna come here to get you.
Come see